So, I designed a PvP build. It's interesting. Now, as you can tell, I'm not exactly in the dark zone running around like a lunatic. So if you would like to see this PvP build in action, there is a link in the description below for Elite Panda, who I gave the build to, and he ran around and did his PvP thing. He is a pretty prominent PvP player. I'm aware everyone likes to brag about it, but I have genuinely, while watching his stream, seen entire dark zones empty because he's in there. So I don't know what that means, but he seems to be pretty good at the old penis versus penis. Now, I am running the build that I gave him, except I have a few less blue cores. In total, this build is a bit weird. I'm not going to say it's my favourite. It's pretty lackluster in PvE, and it took a minute to get used to by exercise of dying a few times. Now, the general gist of this build is, in its design, it is meant to have just enough survivability by two separate mechanics to allow you to burst down an enemy. The issue then lies if there's more than one thing going on. You can very quickly get overwhelmed. In 1v1, this should have mostly no issues. I say mostly because obviously it is going to be build dependent. Different players will run different builds, and this build will react to different builds in a different manner. It's not the new meta, it's not OP. However, what this does have over most other PvP builds is over double the DPS, while still running 5 blue cores. So I took this as the standard PvP build. I don't actually know if it is, I could be wrong. However, I did ask a fair few people and they all basically said it's a variant of that. Sometimes it's the Catharsis mask. Sometimes rather than running Picara's holster, they'll run a Gruppo piece. Blah de blah de blah. But that's like the general gist. And then being that PvP essentially nerfs all your damage by 60%, this is the calculation. It's roughly accurate. I'm within like 2%. So add or take away 2%. The actual damage number that comes out, I'm not too sure, because the equation that they use for it is absolutely mental. It ends up being like some ridiculous number like 58.6993285% damage reduction. So I just went with 60 because fucking easier. That was just as far as I calculated there, and I still wasn't on the money of like exact damage numbers. So how it is exactly calculated, I haven't got a Scooby. And the way in which expertise interacts with this is just absolutely bizarre, because it's almost like it's just not even taken into the equation. So it's kind of like your overall build is reduced to allow for PvP, but if you add 15% from expertise into it, you're literally gaining 15% PvE damage. It's not taken into the PvP equation, which is just dumb. Anyway, the build is as follows. We have a Ridgeway's Pride, Devil's Due for perfect clutch. If you don't have Devil's Due, a Seska backpack with clutch will do, 4-piece strikers and a Vector with Sadist. We are rocking 59% crit chance and 156% critical hit damage, and the power of this build comes from just pure multiplicative damage. So if we cast our mind back to that standard PvP build, this build does like 120% more. The standard PvP build does 871,000 in averaged DPS. The build that I'm showing here does like 1.9 mil. Whoops. Now I'm sure some of you are going to go, oh, but you're running Sages and Ridgeways. People run Hasbro. Don't worry. I got you covered there. We dropped from 1.9 mil down to 1.6 mil. It is still much higher in terms of DPS. The caveat to all of this, though, is just the simple mechanism of how you stay alive. Tardigrade with 5 bleeding enemies gives you like 48% of your armor back per second, which is ridiculous. However, 1 or 2 enemies bleeding isn't going to make much of a difference. It will essentially allow you to be 6 blue cores rather than 5. Clutch is mostly air, and especially if you're just doing like one-on-one fights, it's literally not going to give you anything. However, there are a few moments in Elite Panda's video, which again will be linked in the description, of where Clutch literally did come in quite clutch, being able to kill an enemy or an ad just to proc the secondary bonus of Clutch, and then he was essentially able to out-tank straight up DPS who were also running Unbreakable, and he was still able to kill them. So the overall design of this build is kind of just be complete straight DPS, adding in the fact of where you're running Sadist, you can be a little bit supporty. You could run things like Survivalist just to give your team another 10% amp, because you know you're bleeding enemies. Obviously enemies that are Hasbro'd are going to be a little bit more difficult because you're not going to get, admittedly, yes, minimalistic regen from Ridgeways or the damage amplification from Sadist. However, from what I've seen of Elite Panda's playing with this build, both through his videos as well as his live stream, he did say it does have a pretty good place in sort of PvP setups. He also did say it's going to be one of the builds that he actually keeps, which for me, little proud moment. But like I said, it's not going to be the new meta. It's not overpowered or anything silly. It is just just another niche build in PvP to deal with yet another niche situation. It does allow you to get away from the standard Unbreakable Adrenaline Rush, almost arguably the meta, and this build is kind of like a direct counteraction to that, simply just because with near enough doing over 120% more DPS than them, Adrenaline Rush isn't actually going to save you against this sort of build. Unbreakable might, depending on the DPS that you have, but typically from what I've seen in a straight 1v1 with no surprises, this build does seem to be Unbreakable Adrenaline Rush in just pure Unga Bunga. If they've got a friend though, you might have some trouble. Now the DPS of this is not too shabby in PvE. It's not going to be something I keep personally because it's not really designed for PvE. It's not that way inclined. The armor regen for it is pretty damn good as long as you're able to keep the clutch buff active. The issue here then becomes picking and choosing your fight, which I'm aware in PvP you don't always have that option too. Essentially meaning that if you are going to try out this build, you kind of need to be the aggressor. You need to be the one starting the engagement, because if someone comes up behind you where you're not running Unbreakable, by the time you turn around you're already dead. Anyway, just to show, this is going to be the PvE variant of it. Again though, I don't actually recommend this in PvE. We have 4P strikers as shown. We have 1 crit chance roll on the actual strikers. Everything else is crit damage. Ridgeway's Pride, obviously, with a crit damage mod. I am running Devil's Due, and then obviously the Vector with Sadist. Have fun. Good luck. Don't die. It's bad for the health.